Hi, everybody. We are going to look at the war itself. Mostly, you're going to do this through videos that I have posted, a couple from Khan Academy, and then one from a group called Epic History. That one is very well done, and I really like the maps and the explanations. It's a little bit more detail than you really need to know. So if you're looking at taking that second quiz, which is a paper quiz, know that that's going to be on the first two videos, the Khan Academy videos, plus what I'm telling you right now. And all that detail in the Epic History you can just watch for fun. It's well done, and I think the maps really help you understand a little bit about the Eastern Front, especially since that's not a heavily covered part of the war. Like I said, we're not really going to be doing a lot of detail on World War I, but there are some things I wanted to point out to you. This video that we're going to do should just be like under 7 minutes right now, and then watch the rest of the support stuff from Khan Academy and the other. I had skipped over this slide in the last presentation when we were talking about the different countries joining the war, which was okay because the United States wanted to be neutral. Now, if you remember from your U.S. history class, the United States was in a period of isolationism, and they wanted nothing to do with a European war. And so President Woodrow Wilson said that we would stay out of this European conflict. However, both countries were stopping our shipping lanes, not allowing our shipping to be neutral. And then we ended up with a new thing called the Unterseeboot, right? The U-boat. And the U-boat broke the previous rules of war. This was not something that people were used to, and there was this idea that when you were going to attack a ship, especially a commercial ship of any kind, that you would first fire warning shots, allow the crew to disembark. You would not sink a merchant ship of civilians. But the U-boat technology, if you remember from your United States history, that didn't really go with this new method. And there were also a mixture of wartime ships that were also bringing commercial goods and the opposite. And so the U.S. really warned Germany that they must stop this. The U-boat technology pushed the United States away from Germany. There were a couple other things. There was a natural history of relationship between the British and the U.S. anyway. But there were a lot of German immigrants and Irish immigrants in the United States that would have preferred to see the U.S. side with Germany and Austria if given the choice. However, we decided to declare neutrality. And I mentioned in the last video that Woodrow Wilson ran for re-election. And when he was running for re-election in the 2 years leading up to his reelection in 1916, there was a lot of talk about, oh, he kept us out of war, he kept us out of war. And Wilson tried to warn against this a little bit because he could probably see the writing on the wall. However, he was reelected as this peacetime president, and by 1917, the United States would enter the war. This was after a series of things. Some people think that it's the sinking of the Lusitania that brought the United States into war. It really was not. It was the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare that's talked about here. Germany had this new technology, and they were kind of asked by the rest of the world not to use it. And so when they were had sunk the Sussex, they made the Sussex Pledge, saying that they would not use their submarines in an unrestricted fashion. When they realized that this was a big advantage to them, they resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, and this caused the United States to declare war and to enter the war. This is going to be a big deal because the United States is going to break the Western Front stalemate coming into the war as late as they do, and with a fresh with fresh soldiers and fresh budget and fresh spirit. But we'll get to that later. Let's talk a little bit about the fight in the war. You might have heard before that the Western Front in World War I was a stalemate, and by stalemate we mean a area of non-movement where there's really very little gains for either side. Very few gains, very few losses. This is something that you see often in World War I movies when you were looking at people walking the lines of the trenches or sitting in trenches, waiting in trenches. maybe trying to eventually cross into no man's land for a short stint, but mostly a lot of waiting and a lot of death, a lot of trench foot, a lot of psychological damage, a lot of shelling that doesn't really lead to any particular gains. And so that happened on the Western Front. How did we get there? Well, basically, here's the lineup. Okay, now you're going to notice in that epic history video that Italy, okay, is part of a triple alliance. But when it comes time for Italy to commit, they refuse to do so. So even though they're allied, remember I talked about this, they're allied to Austria and to Germany. They claim that it's not a defensive war, that Germany and Austria have violated those rules, and so they're not necessarily needing to join. And so you have here the physical setup of Western Europe. And what we want to concentrate on when we talk about that Western stalemate is this right here, an area where there is very little movement on the Western Front. And then we'll look at the Eastern Front on the other side of the war. So when the battles first opened, there were no trenches dug at this point, and it wasn't trench warfare. One of the first key battles of the war was the Marne. Now, there was a first battle of the Marne, and then there was a later battle of the Marne, a second battle of the Marne. This first battle is where the Germans almost took out the French. Remember I talked about the Schlieffen Plan, how they had tried to go in and attack Paris as soon as possible. And so this made for some very early battles for which the French were unprepared and the Germans were ready to go. Remember, they had great mobilization way back in 1866, and they still didn't. They didn't need to worry about that front with the Russians for 6 weeks. And so the miracle on the Marne, although it had very high casualty rates of about 500,000 people counting both sides, the French were able, the French and a British unit were able to push back the Germans, and this was called the miracle of the Marne. But soon the Western stalemate did descend into trench warfare. And what's really amazing is that these trenches were dug to the point where you really almost could walk an almost unbroken 350-mile line of trenches at the Western Front at one point. This is a very sad way to fight a war, a very difficult way to fight a war, a very frustrating way to fight a war. And yet this was what happened on the Western Front, a very evenly matched, very deadly stalemate that occurs. There is a book that is a short book if you're interested in reading right now, and you should be, because I know that you guys are watching probably a little too many movies and a little too much TV. There's a great book that you can get. When I say great, I don't mean light, but it's a short book about this reality, and it's called All Quiet on the Western Front by Eric Remarque. And I encourage students to read it every year. It is from a German soldier's perspective. I'm trying to think of the name of that World War I movie that I went to see that just came out. That'd also be a good thing to watch. It was very good. I'll think of it and I'll tell you in one of the future videos because I'm not going to remember right now. Maybe I should pause this. Hold on. Okay. The name of the movie is 1917. So in any case, we were talking about trench warfare, right? Hopefully I didn't mess up this video. And we are now talking about the race to the sea. So as this trench warfare digs in, before the long stalemate, there was a series of battles in which the Germans are moving north. The British and French are out trying to outflank. And this is what allows all these trenches eventually to be dug, the race to the sea. And then what that creates a stagnant Western Front. This is very frustrating. And that's really what you see in 1917. The movie is an attempt to break through the front. You'll notice that they send 2 men forward while everyone else is going to stay back. It shows a little bit about the war in the trenches at the beginning, and then the concept of no man's land as soldiers move out from the trenches. But this can be contrasted to the war in the East. The war in the East was not a trench warfare, and it was not stagnant. You saw a lot more back and forth between first of all, the Austro-Hungarians, who at first did have some successes in the war against the slower to prepare Russians, and the Germans and the Russians. One of the stories about Russia is that they did have some victories, but they were woefully unprepared economically for this war, militarily, in their weapons technology for this war. And so the losses to the Russians were extremely high in the Eastern Front. I'll let that epic history video talk to you a little bit more about the Eastern Front and some of the major battles that happened there. Once again, we're not going to be talking a lot about battles, and you're not going to be responsible. I do want you to be able to contrast the Western and the Eastern fronts of the war. Whereas the Western Front is a stalemate, the Eastern Front is a much more traditional war where there are gains and losses for both sides. Eventually, the Russians are going to pull out of the war, and that means no more fighting on the Eastern Front. For the Germans, they're going to be able to concentrate on the Western Front of the war. And at this time, the only thing that really saves, I think, the Allies is the entry of the United States into the war on the Western Front. All right. Let's just talk a little bit about the costs of the war. This is costs in terms of dead and wounded, as well as mobilized. So you can see Russia mobilized 12 million troops. That's pretty amazing considering the fact that they pulled out of the war in 1917. Germany, Great Britain, France, Austria-Hungary, Italy, the U.S., Turkey, Bulgaria, and so on from there. But if you look at the numbers of dead reaching almost 2 million for both Russia and Germany, this was an extremely, extremely costly war. Those wounded and missing, sometimes those numbers can be a little bit deceiving because of the way that war casualties are recorded, and sometimes they can be a little bit inflated. Sometimes they can be a little bit under. But World War I had massive costs to Europe. And you guys have all read about this in the Lost Generation, and you've talked about this in your literature classes and probably in your U.S. history class. But the Russians were amongst the hardest hit. The Germans as well. But the Russians were often going to battle with very little hope of victory, but really very little hope of anything to go home to. And sometimes, by some points in the war, very little hope of having any ammunition or perhaps even weapons. You've probably heard before that Russian soldiers were sometimes sent into battle without any weapons and told to pick up guns from the dead, from their own dead. And, you know, why would someone go in to fight without a weapon? Well, because if you turned around and tried to run the other way, then you would be shot by your own command. So the Russian people were embittered by this war. Many of them did not agree with the war. Many did. And we'll talk about that in the Russian Revolution and what ends up happening. But this is a war with extremely high costs. We're going to skip ahead a little bit to Versailles. Because of the high cost of the war, the anger about the war, the difficulty in ending the war, and these page numbers will be irrelevant. I wish I had taken these off. I didn't see them. They won't go with your current book, I don't think. Then the wartime post conferences, the peace conferences, were very difficult. At the peace conference, the U.S., Great Britain, and France were considered the big three. The Italian Prime Minister Vittorio Orlando was there at the peace conference, and he believed that because Italy had joined in 1915 that he was going to get some things, but he was largely ignored and overlooked by the big three, and so that made the Italians very unhappy with the results of the conference. The Allies quarreled with one another. Probably the most bitter of the three were the French. They wanted Germany to pay, and to pay heavily for not just what had happened in World War I, but for their previous ills. The British, who had been in the war since the beginning, were probably second. The U.S., their main thing, remember, they were not in the war very long, and President Wilson believed that it would be his legacy to have a successful League of Nations that would prevent future wars. And so he wanted to be much more lenient to the Germans. and to just work out things with a new map and new promises to war. David Lloyd George, who was the British Prime Minister, and George Clemenceau, they want harsher terms. And so there's some disagreement amongst the representatives at the Treaty of Versailles. Here are some of the specific results of the treaty. Since France could not continue the war and they did not want to spark another issue with Germany, they gave in to the British and to the U.S. and got some of what they wanted, but not all of what they wanted. They did get Alsace-Lorraine back. Germany was stripped of its colonies. The German army was limited. You probably remember this from our talking back in 8th grade about Hitler's aggression to rebuild the army, even though he wasn't allowed to. There were a lot of new areas created here. If you look, Poland, Danzig, Rhineland, the occupation of the Rhineland, the payment of reparations, it's famous from the Treaty of Versailles, reparations that were impossible for Germany to pay back. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was dissolved into Austria and Hungary. The Ottoman Empire was dissolved, and the Middle East had a new arrangement. So what did all this look like? Well, these are some of the territorial changes that came about as a result of Versailles. You see that Ireland is going to get its own republic. You see the creation of Yugoslavia, which was kind of a catch-all. Of course, you know your modern European map, and it certainly doesn't look like Yugoslavia anymore. But this was kind of a catch-all for various Slavic and non-Slavic peoples, and that caused a lot of problems that wouldn't be worked out even until the 1990s. It's pretty amazing. You see Czechoslovakia created, which is also different from the European map today. And so you see this area of East Prussia carved out here, Poland, you see the creation of the USSR. So a lot of changes that happened as a result of Versailles. Not everybody thought the people at Versailles did a very good job of dividing up that map. It did not take into account a lot of ethnicities, a lot of traditional enemies, a lot of traditional allies. Nonetheless, that's what was created. And the bitter legacy of Versailles with its reparations, its blame clause, and those other realities, it did not leave good feelings in the hearts of Germans or in the hearts of Austrians who had adopted Germany as their country. Right here, Adolf Hitler, very, very angry about the end of the war itself, and even more angry about Versailles and what he thought that Germany had sold itself out. At the Weimar government had given away what they should not have given away. That bitter legacy of the war is going to lead us eventually to World War II. We're getting a little ahead of ourselves, so I'm going to let you watch these support videos, and then the next time we talk, I'll be talking to you about Russia. Thank you.